this morning comes from First Samuel chapter 3. And so we are leaving our New Testament story to return to one you may or may not know. So First Samuel chapter 3. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again, a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I will swear to the house of Eli that the iniquities of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever." Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell his vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." He said, "Here I am." And Eli said, "What is it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing. And then he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, and I have entitled this sermon, "The Rise of the Prophetic Voice." In the Presbyterian Church, we are sometimes wary of the term prophet. We often associate prophet with things like fortune telling, overzealous evangelicals, or people who only existed in biblical times. Yet the role of prophets in the Bible is quite vast. While there are often individuals that were called to be prophets, every believer is called to be prophetic in how they live their lives. See, because in the biblical tradition, prophets were not only people who predicted future events or had unique relationships with God. A prophet was someone uniquely gifted to interpret the times. They were people who advocated for people on behalf of God and talked to God about the people. Prophets were often formed out of tumultuous times in history in order to strengthen moral clarity, inspire transformation, and challenge social norms and injustices. They were often people who confronted corrupt leadership and advocated for better conditions of the church and society. As Angela Davis once said, radical simply means grasping things at the root. Prophets were people who simply called people back to their core values, their past, and their potential in order to carve out a new future. But in our biblical story today, it is clear that such leadership was desperately needed in the community of God. During these days, there was a deep need for change. The leadership of Eli the priest had unfortunately become marked by spiritual decay and compromised integrity. The text says that Eli's eyesight was failing, which was a symbol for the gradual loss of spiritual discernment, of moral clarity in him and in the surrounding community. His influence was failing. Eli did not hold the same power and courage that he once had. Over time, Eli had grown comfortable with wrongdoing and refused to confront his family's actions. Eli, like others in his community, had failed to address the plight of the marginalized and the pressing needs of the oppressed. He was complicit in suffering and unrighteousness that had unfolded. This had serious consequences for him and the people in his community. Though he was still technically a priest and still technically going through the motions, God had stopped speaking to him. And thus there was no one to interpret the times, no one to lead the people forward. The days had become dark and grim, the future become uncertain. Yet the good news is that God still finds a way to break through the dim and dark. In this story, young Samuel emerges as this new voice chosen by God to bring about change in the community. A new leader who will lead the people with energy, imagination, love, and wisdom. A leader who will have courage to confront power structures and the corruption that Eli allowed to go on. A leader who will learn how to rightly interpret the times, refusing to call evil good and good evil. A leader who will help the people return to God, their first love, their calling, their desired end. Samuel is the beginning of a new chapter. At first, Samuel does not recognize God's voice. It takes him a few times to practice cultivating his gift. He has to learn how to hear, how to listen, how to discern. He has to practice asking questions, developing intimacy, trying and failing again. It is interesting that it is Eli who God is no longer speaking to, who has lost his integrity. Eli, who once had all the access to power, but did not know how to yield it properly, who recognizes that it is God speaking to Samuel. In the end, the message is clear, that when leaders fail, God continues raising up new ones. And that when one chapter closes, another one is already on the way. When God desires freedom for the people, God will provide a prophetic voice. When God makes a promise, God will bring it to completion. And so in the end, God uses a brave Samuel to deliver a sobering message to Eli and to the people. And yet it is not just a message to Eli, it is a warning to all leaders who risk losing the favor of God when they ignore moral decay. It is an indictment on all those who would ignore or make excuses for mistreatment, discrimination, religious violence. To all those who may have become stagnant or comfortable, it is a reminder to stay awake and to not give in to the popular or the powerful. To all those capable of shifting culture and laws, it is a challenge for them to prioritize mercy and justice. It is a reminder for all within the community to prioritize integrity, accountability, and the pursuit of justice inside worship and in the world. And of course, we know Samuel goes on to become this pivotal figure in Israel, signaling this new era of leadership, this new understanding of community. And he was able to lead the people into a new chapter, not because of formal training, but because of his courage, his willingness to say what needed to be said, even if it went against the patterns of the day. Tomorrow is Dr. King Day, where we recognize the life and accomplishments of a leader sensitive to the prophetic needs of his day. We remember a time similar to our own in which the struggle for racial justice had a particular flavor and bend, in which Black people were denied particular rights and opportunities to move through society with dignity and protection. We remember, too, the way that political leaders and religious professionals alike had grown complacent in the upholding of that status quo. How people who had been elected and given power forfeited their right to be trusted, to do what was just. And on the one hand, we may expect this from politicians, how easily they can be led astray by money and bribery. Oops. But lest we forget how many leaders in the church had also grown stale at this time. Lest we forget that it was not just politicians, but preachers on Sundays who had also grown stale in their preaching and their ability to properly discern and interpret the times. Those preachers who stood in pulpits on Sunday mornings preaching about order, but not about justice, who preached about personal responsibility, but not justice, who preached about grace and turning the other cheek, but not about justice, who preached about heaven, but not about justice. No, many of them preached a message that actively discouraged people from getting involved and causing a stir, from getting into trouble or getting too far out of line. Some of them preached that good Christians needed to get better at patience, simply waiting a little while. Don't be so radical after our ancestors did so much just to get us here, they'd say. Don't do so much to get in the way. So many religious leaders that King was responding to, like Eli, had lost their ability to hear the voice of God, even as they watched a new chapter take off in the life of another. But like Samuel, the good news began to take root anyhow. The civil rights movement was an interruption in what had always been, a great inbreaking, a prophetic awakening was happening in the lives of all people, whether they were ready for it or not. We saw this not just in the voice of MLK, but in those who taught and nurtured him and came alongside him, the Coretta Scott Kings, the Bayard Rustins, the Ella Bakers. In each of their lives, God was raising up new voices to signal that the world was about to turn. They turned because they heard a new sound in the voice of God. A new sound that had started to grow stale in the lives of so many other leaders, calling them in a new direction. Because of Dr. King's willingness to heed the call, he had courage to confront corrupt leadership, racial hierarchy, militarism, and economic inequality. Much like Samuel, in our text today, Dr. King possessed a spirit that was malleable, ready to be shaped in harmony with the shifting tides of the time. Both men exhibited openness, willingness, and responsiveness to God. Dr. King, like Samuel, had a faith that transcended mere silent hope or spectatorship. It compelled him to take action. Similar to Samuel, Dr. King possessed the remarkable ability to speak to those in power, challenging the status quo. Yet, like Samuel, Dr. King was not without imperfections. He faced temptations. He had biases to unlearn. He grappled with his own ego and held his own opinions about how things should unfold. He had advisors whose contributions have gone unnoticed. But despite these human complexities, God's work prevailed. The work of freedom extended beyond individual shortcomings, demonstrating the enduring impact of their collective efforts together. Today we recognize that the work initiated by these two men remains unfinished. There is a significant amount of work ahead. We know that systems of oppression do not disappear, they tend to evolve and change shape. We also know that while not everybody may bear the specific title of a prophet in their lifetime, every believer is called to live prophetically, an integral aspect of our spiritual heritage that we have inherited, which is just as crucial as contemplation and worship, study, prayer, giving, and attending church. Just as crucial is embracing this call to justice, which requires that we become accustomed to discerning God's voice, listening for God's voice for ourselves, following that voice. And integral to that is understanding how power operates in our context, who it benefits, and whether or not that is just. It may even require that we ask ourselves where we tend to be silent or complacent. Are there things we've said or didn't say that we regret? Are there issues that make us uneasy? Are there forms of lament or truth-telling that make us uncomfortable? Both Samuel and King understood that hearing God's voice can lead to bold and sometimes dangerous actions, challenging authority figures and expressing difficult truths in order to promote greater freedom and safety for those overlooked. As we leave this space, let us carry with us the challenge to be prophetic voices, advocating for the marginalized, challenging corruption, and tirelessly pursuing truth. For when God desires freedom for the people, God provides a prophetic voice. May we be those voices, ushering in new forms of leadership, community, and the pursuit of God's justice in us and among us. Amen. And now is your opportunity to share aloud things that may be bubbling up in you, how this message might be moving in you. Yes, Peter.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very, very powerful message. It had so much in it. It covered a wide perspective of issues and concerns. I think that I was thinking as you were speaking that we today here in America are in need for a new prophetic voice. And the fact that God knows this and God is already preparing the way for us and our democratic system in ways that we don't even understand. But I think that it's important for us to remain vigilant for the signs of the coming of a new form of government that will do justice to our democratic system and be pleasing in God's sight. I'm thinking along those lines and hoping and praying for God's guidance for our immediate future here, which is not just for us in America, but it's for the world because of the impact that America has on the world. So, anyway, thank you very much. You gave us so much to think about today.
Thank you for that, Peter. I agree. There is a need for another voice, and yet I also wonder if voices are speaking. And the question is, do we know where to look, and are we listening to those voices? Because certainly there have been, since this civil rights movement, many other movements, maybe that take different shapes, but that have called us into deeper examination of racial justice, of gender justice, of LGBT justice, of climate justice. And are we listening? And so, where is God moving today? I think is a good question to ask. But thank you for that.
I was thinking about John Lewis's good trouble that he talked about, and how often good trouble is what makes us pay attention. But the problem is that we're so used to maybe obeying the law that we don't really look at what good trouble is trying to tell us. So it doesn't mean that we have to break the law, but it means that we have to know when it's the right law and when it's doing the right thing.
Right.
And that's not always so easy.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I love that, quote from John Lewis about getting into good trouble and also finding a way to get in the way. It's also one of my favorite things. Of course, we don't live our lives trying to break the law. And we also know that, as Dr. King told us, we're not servants to the state. We are supposed to be the conscience of the state. And so when it doesn't do what it says that it's going to do, or it's doing something that's violent, we have to make choices. And that's part of that discernment work of which voices we're listening to, and where our loyalty lies, for sure. Yes, Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooke. That was it was wonderful. And I agree. I was thinking that we need to be able to discern the voices, but I still feel there's a need for a voice that can be heard above the separation that we have. Because I think the thing that was, I'll say unique, it's probably maybe not the best word, but I'm going to say unique, about King was that everyone on every side, I think, knew what he wanted or what he was suggesting. They may not have necessarily have agreed with him, but everybody heard him. And I just don't feel like today there's people that are heard on one side or the other, but not across the spectrum. And we need someone who can be heard and understood across the spectrum. That's, you know, that's sort of my feeling, because it seems like now when someone that we hear and say, oh, that person is absolutely right, immediately there's pushback on the other side and not a willingness or an ability to hear and listen. There's just immediate pushback and sort of trying to find a way to counter what that person is saying, so that even if they understand it, they don't want it to get out there, so that other people will, you know, I don't know. That's how that's,
Yeah, I mean, our times are unique for sure.
yeah.
I mean, I think even with King, I mean, I think he's gotten that appeal
Right.
since he's died, but I think at the time he was also very divisive,
Right. He was
extremely divisive.
They knew exactly what he was doing, and that's why I think even within the government, you know, we're hearing what was going on within the FBI and government places. I mean, so I don't know. I just think we need I'd like to see an example of someone who could get through to both sides, and maybe it's not possible, but I hope God is working on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Great reflection. Any others? Anyone on Zoom? Let's see. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for the conversation.